discussion on politics and policymaking with an emphasis on polarization in the nation's capital. Of course, we have a new chapter that's about to begin, and everybody's going to be happy. The Republicans are going to sit down with Obama, and they're going to pass an immigration bill, reform the tax code. It's a miracle what they're going to do, and our panel is going to explain exactly how that miracle is going to take place. We'll get into that during the question and answer. The format for the event is it will feature a longer presentation followed by two shorter presentations on the general topic of politics and policymaking and polarization, but from three different perspectives. I'll then engage in a stump the panel contest for about 10 minutes, and that will leave about 30 minutes. We're a little behind now for audience participation, so it comes off your time. Very sorry. We're going to begin with Douglas McAdam, the Ray Lyman Wilbur Professor of Sociology at Stanford. And Doug will soon publish a book about the same topic that he's going to discuss here. The book is called The Origins of Our Fractured Society. Who knew? In his presentation today, he'll focus on the role of race and religion in the origins of our divisive politics. So he's a sociologist, but this is really history. Then following Doug, we'll hear from Michelle Swears from the Department of Government at Georgetown. Michelle will talk about the role of women in Congress and in polarization in Congress, based in part on her 2013 book, Women in the Club, Gender and Policy Making in the Senate. And then following her, we'll hear from Gabriel Sanchez from the Department of Political Science at the University of New Mexico, right here from New Mexico. He's also the executive director of the Robert Wood Johnson Center on Health Policy there. And Gabe will concentrate his remarks on the dramatic changes in the racial and ethnic composition of the American electorate. So, Doug, it's all yours.
Let me start by thanking Ron for presiding over the session and Gabriel and Michelle for participating. The best part of these sessions is always kind of the give and take afterwards, so I'm going to try to be brief. What I want to do with my time is two things. First, I want to talk about kind of the origins of our present political divisions, offer a kind of brief stylized account of that kind of answer to the origins question. I think a lot of our attention in recent years has been focused on very recent events, Obama's election, a kind of racial reaction to Obama's presidency, the rise of the Tea Party, etc. But the origins of our current divisions are at least 50 years old, and I think it's important for us to realize that the roots of our present dysfunction, if you will, are that far back. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. And then secondly, toward the end of the talk, if I have time, I'm going to offer some very brief remarks on the midterms and how we might, over time, start to rebuild a political middle and get out of the kind of gridlocked mess we're in at the present time. But let me again start with the origins question. As Ron said, actually, he said a book is forthcoming. A book is out. It's been out for about a month. And actually, the title, and this isn't his doing, we changed the title at the last minute. It's called Deeply Divided Racial Politics and Social Movements in Post-War America. Book came out about a month ago. Co-author Karina Clues, who's a graduate student of mine at Stanford. And essentially, again, the motivating question for the book is the origins question. How did we go from the striking bipartisanship and comparative economic equality of the post-World War II era to the deep political and economic divisions that are so evident in America today? The answer we offer is 350 pages long. We talk about lots of factors, lots of complicated interacting change processes. Here, given time constraints, I'm going to talk about only one factor, but arguably the most important. It certainly is the principal storyline or a major storyline that runs through the whole of the book. And that has to do with a dramatic transformation shift in what we call the racial geography of American politics. This kicks in literally in 1960, that accelerates through the 60s and beyond, and has all sorts of powerful upstream consequences that we're still living with today. Among those consequences is a real transformation of the two parties, a remaking of the two parties. To appreciate the magnitude of the shift or the redefinition of the two major parties, let me remind you of how different the two major parties were on the eve of the 60s. So here's the GOP on the eve of the 60s. The ideological kind of center of gravity of the party is clearly moderate centrist in orientation. The party is geographically centered in the Midwest and northeastern United States. I'm old enough to remember when New York was a fairly reliable Republican state. Lots of ideological overlap between the two parties in Congress. That is, there were many Republicans who were more liberal than Democrats in both the House and Senate. And the Republicans were much more liberal or progressive on issues of race or civil rights than the Democrats. The Democrats on the eve of the 60s, in the aggregate, they too were moderate centrist in kind of ideological orientation. Their geographical center was really the southern United States. Also, again, considerable ideological overlap with the GOP. And on matters of race, they were incredibly schizophrenic, simultaneously accommodating both the most progressive or liberal and most conservative positions on race within the same party. And again, this is how different the parties were then from now. And this structure, this identity for the two parties had been remarkably stable up to 1960. Essentially, this system, kind of regional alignments within American politics, had held since the beginning of the Civil War. So we're talking about literally a 100-year period with very little change. But everything is about to change. It's going to change quickly, and again, with big consequences upstream. What's the sort of dynamic of change? Our argument in the book is that two linked parallel struggles exploding in the 1960s are going to start pushing these two parties off-center and changing them in the process. Those two linked struggles are the civil rights movement on the one hand and the white resistance counter-movement or white backlash to the civil rights movement, which we often don't think of as a movement, but it was. And those two movements are going to disrupt this system in a very big and important way. Let me start with I wanted to offer this for those. I do this for students, and they can't believe that the Republicans were more liberal on racial matters. So I throw in evidence to that effect. This is congressional voting, actually Senate voting. It's congressional voting on the 1957 Civil Rights Act. This was substantively a very weak bill, but symbolically very important. This is the first piece of federal civil rights legislation since Reconstruction in the 1870s. So it was very important, again, symbolically, and it passes because of overwhelming Republican support. If it were up to the Democrats, it would not have passed. More evidence of the same, to underscore the same point. This is data from a book that came out 25 or so years ago, very good book called Issue Evolution. Carmine and Stimson were the authors. Part of the data they present in the book is coding of the civil rights voting records of the members of Congress over time. This is the 85th Congress, which convened in 58-59. 42 of 46 Republican senators are coded as racial liberals as compared to 21 of 48 Democrats. All right, now to the change. So let's start with the civil rights movement. This is time series data on civil rights movement actions from 1948 to 1976. I coded these data back in grad school with my very hands late into the night, going blind in the process. This was part of the empirical basis for my dissertation, which subsequently became a book called Political Process in the Development of Black Insurgency. I don't put these data up there to share that heart-warming story with you. I put them up there to underscore an important point and to correct, I think, something of a mythic or kind of a myth about the civil rights movement. Our canonical account of the civil rights movement is that it begins in Montgomery in 1955-56 with the bus boycott that thrust Martin Luther King Jr. into a kind of national leadership role, etc. And it's true, Montgomery was terribly important, but it's that little teeny spike towards the left of the figure. The myth is that after Montgomery, the movement was an unstoppable force. It was not. The massive resistance, the mobilization of massive resistance in the South in the wake of Montgomery, and especially, I would say, in the wake of the 1954 Brown v. Board education decision, that massive resistance in the South, lots of legislation throughout the region, anti-civil rights legislation, increase in white violence, white supremacist groups grew more active. The movement was essentially stopped in its tracks in the late 50s, as you can see. The movement on the eve of the 60s is moribund. What revitalizes the movement is the sit-ins in the spring of 1960, and that's that second, much more substantial spike. That's what kickstarts this extraordinary heyday of civil rights activism that extends 6, 7, 8 years at least into the 1960s. It's hard to think of another movement in U.S. history that mobilized and sustained that level of pressure on the American state the way the civil rights movement did. This is, again, 7, 8, 9 years of unrelenting pressure on America and the American state to put its racial house in order. And it's worth noting that the stewards of the American state during this period are two successive Democratic administrations, Kennedy and Johnson. And the pressure that the civil rights movement puts on those administrations is going to pit the two wings of the Democratic Party or put them in conflict. These are the two important components of the New Deal coalition: liberal Northern labor, the liberal Northern labor wing of the party, and the Southern segregationist wing of the party. Initially, I would argue grudgingly under Kennedy, the party begins to shift left on the issue of civil rights, but much more aggressively, much more courageously, much more creatively under Johnson, the party moves sharply left. Okay, if I must. In any case, under Johnson, the party moves much more aggressively left on the issue of civil rights. It's going to move left on a number of other issues as well. And while we celebrate, this is the 50th anniversary, after all, of the Civil Rights Act of '64, we celebrate Johnson's kind of leadership in helping to enact these two signal pieces of civil rights legislation, Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65. It comes at considerable political cost to the Democrats. It cost them the southern wing of the party. This is the '64 electoral map. Johnson wins a stunning triumph, a real landslide. He's at the peak of his popularity. The only dissent is from Arizona, Barry Goldwater's home state, and for the first time in history, the Deep South. The White South gets over its historic enmity to the Republican Party, the evil party of Lincoln. They hold their collective noses and they vote Republican. Given the magnitude of Johnson's triumphs, something of the significance of the shift is lost on the general public, but it sends shockwaves through the two parties. Political analysts and strategists in both parties recognize that this is a world turned upside down. You really get a sense of that when you compare it to another electoral map just 8 years earlier. This is Eisenhower's second-term election in 1956. You see the map is red except for the solid Democratic South holding on, and this is '64. We've just flipped the map. So this is going to have huge consequences. It's splitting apart the New Deal coalition for the Democrats. But I said this is a story of two movements, not just one. And so we're going to talk about the white resistance movement. We think of that initially as kind of a southern phenomena. We have these iconic images of fire hoses and police dogs in Birmingham, burning buses, etc. But in point of fact, this comes to have national resonance as well. And no figure really symbolized this kind of national resistance, helped to express it, catalyze it, channel it, more so than Alabama's segregationist governor, George Wallace. I'm going to play a little clip from his inaugural address, if I can get this to work. There it is. Maybe not. No, I'm not getting any sound. What he is saying is that he's going to throw down the gauntlet against tyranny from the federal government, and he vows segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, to thunderous applause. That's his inaugural address in January of 1963. In that same address, he vows to stand in the schoolhouse door to block school desegregation in the state of Alabama. And 4 months later, he has a chance to do exactly that in this kind of grandstand political theater. The gentleman on the right is Nicholas Katzenback, who's an assistant U.S. Attorney General. He's accompanying the first two students who've been admitted to the black students who've been admitted to the University of Alabama, but Wallace is standing in the schoolhouse door to prevent their admission. This is all theater. It all ends in a few minutes. The media, Wallace leaves, the media leaves, Katzenback leaves, the two students are quietly admitted, but this is the front page picture, and it makes Wallace a hero, not just in the South, but as we'll see, to a lot of individuals, a lot of racial conservatives in the country as a whole. I'm old enough to remember this picture on the front page of the Los Angeles Times, where I grew up. I also remember how the mainstream media tended to characterize Wallace as really kind of wacky, almost a joke, and that was the kind of the general image, again, among the mainstream media. About 7 months later, after Kennedy is assassinated and Johnson has taken office, Wallace again seizes headlines by announcing that he's going to challenge the sitting president of his own party, Lyndon Johnson, for the Democratic nomination for president. And again, the general reaction, this is a joke. Johnson, again, is at the peak of his popularity, not necessarily because everybody loved LBJ, was because he had kind of wrapped himself in the mantle of Kennedy and said that if elected, his goal was to carry out Kennedy's vision for America, and made him an immensely popular figure going into the '64 election. Wallace says he's going to challenge, again, the sitting president of his own party, and people think this is a joke. They stop laughing pretty quickly, however. He enters 3 northern primaries in the run-up to the general election. The first is Wisconsin, very much a northern liberal labor state, and he picks up a third of the vote of registered Democrats. This is not a vote across all of Wisconsin. These are registered Democratic voters. He receives a third of the votes, and there's a non-trivial African-American population in Wisconsin at this time. The estimate is that he probably carried 40% of the vote of white Democrats in the state. The party is just astounded by this. They vow to stop him in Indiana, which is a more conservative state. They throw lots of money into the state for TV ads. They also trot out a bunch of luminaries to warn of the dangers of Wallace. He still takes 31% of the vote. And then he narrowly loses in Maryland, and he clearly captures the majority of white registered Democrats in the state of Maryland. Wallace is showing in these primaries absolutely underscore just how much support there is, how much opposition there is to the civil rights revolution, not just in the South, but nationwide. So as the Democrats are moving left on the issue and changing as a party, the Republicans, the previously more liberal of the two parties on the issue of civil rights, are moving sharply to the right in hopes of picking up more support not only in the South, but white racial conservatives nationwide. This is not the end of the story by any means. Nixon runs in '68 on what he calls his Southern strategy. He winds up narrowly beating Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace, who runs as a third-party candidate. And Nixon's civil rights policies during his first term in office moved the Republicans that much further to the right. So much so, by the end of the decade, the Republicans are already well on their way to becoming the kind of disproportionately white, overwhelmingly Southern, or primarily Southern party that we know today. Again, there's lots more stories upstream. There's lots of things that happened in the 70s, 80s, 90s. We talk about those things in the book. But here, before I leave you, I want to show you just how thorough this transformation of the two parties has been. So this is today, this is today, the racial composition of the two parties, the voters who support the two candidates. This is 2012 election data. 90% of those who voted for Romney in that election were white. Only 10% were other races or ethnic groups. 60% of those who cast ballots for Obama were white. 40% were other racial groups. Very different racial composition than previously. This is election data going back a ways. You see that in 1956, Eisenhower, the Republican winner of that race, actually captured 40% of the black vote. Nixon in 60 took 25%. So the black vote was much more competitive early on. Regionally, we see this incredible shift. In 1963, there's virtually no Republican presence in the House from the South. Today, about half of the Republican House delegation is from the South. And you see the reverse trend for the Democrats over the last 50 years. The consequences from this shift have been tremendous. I mean, have been very consequential. This is party polarization over the last, 140 years or so. You see we are the least polarized in that post-war period. As the parties split apart, we see this extraordinary increase in party polarization. We are in uncharted territory in both the House and Senate now. The result of that, in part, has been an inability for Congress to really pass meaningful legislation. This is the number of bills passed by Congress from 48 to 2002. In the post-war period, we were averaging 1,500 enactments per session of Congress. In the last full session of Congress, the 112th Congress, record low number of enactments, 283. Jimmy Carter last year in a speech in Atlanta said, America is no longer a functioning democracy. I think that was a tad of an exaggeration. What I do think is true is we no longer have a functioning legislative body or branch at the federal level. How do we get nothing about the midterms change these fundamental facts? I wanted to say something about them. My time is up. Hopefully in the Q&A, I can come back and talk a little bit about how we might be able to move forward and sort of regain the ability to govern from the middle. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Michelle Swears from Georgetown University. I'm very happy to be here, very honored to be on a panel with Doug McAdam, Gabe Sanchez, and Ron Haskins. So I was asked to speak today about the role of women in polarization. This is the cover of my new book. I do that for my mom, so everybody can see. And the book is about the role of women in the Senate and what role they play in policy, on both the Democratic and the Republican side. But today I'll talk a little more broadly about the role that women have played in polarization as voters, as members of Congress. The first thing that I want to show you is something that people don't always know. So most people know that compared to the number of women in the population, women are vastly underrepresented in Congress. After the 2014 midterm, some people are kind of celebrating because now there's over 100 women in Congress, but there's still 535 seats there. So, you know, it's a big celebration, but not that big. So this kind of shows you the partisan division. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, what you should be thinking about in terms of polarization, is that women come in at about the same time that Congress polarizes. And this has a lot of consequences for the type of women that get elected, the type of policies that they focus on. So what this is showing you, the red and the blue, the lower ones are the U.S. Senate, the upper ones are the House of Representatives, And the very easy trend that you should be seeing here is that in the early years, so I think 1970s through the early 90s, there's just not a lot of women in Congress, and there's about an even number of Republican and Democratic women. But once we have the 103rd Congress, which is preceded by the 1992 election, which many people call the Year of the Woman election, that Year of the Woman election is actually the year of the Democratic woman. So it's when President Clinton gets elected. The issues that were focused on were things like health care policy, which continues to be a focus, the end of the Cold War. The number of women in Congress was actually an issue because of hearings related to Clarence Thomas's confirmation to the Supreme Court, issues of sexual harassment, and people noticed that there weren't any women on the Judiciary Committee that was considering him, which shouldn't have been a surprise because at the time there were only 2 women in the Senate, so not a lot to go around. But what happens is you start to get an increase in the number of Democratic women, and that increase in divergence between the number of Democratic and Republican women continues to today. So today, Democratic women make up about 30% of the Democratic caucuses in the House and Senate, while the Republican women, even after the current elections, still make up less than 10% of the Republican caucus. So in a year where the Republicans are the majority in Congress, that means that women members of Congress don't have as much influence over the policy agenda because they just make up a much smaller proportion of that party. Now, why it is that there aren't more Republican women versus Democratic women kind of remains a mystery. We do know that women tend to get elected from districts that are both higher income but also more urban and more diverse. And in the current politics, these districts, if you read about sorting and polarization, these districts tend to be Democratic districts. But even at the Senate level, where redistricting, doesn't matter, if you look at the Senate, in the current Senate, 16 of the women are Democrats, 4 of them are Republicans. Next time, we don't have the full picture yet, because Mary Landrieu's in a runoff, but there will be 6 Republican women, which is the highest number of Republican women we've had in the Senate thus far, which isn't really that high. So what I do want to show you is, again, thinking about that 1992 number, it's good to put it up against general statistics about polarization in Congress. So what you're seeing here is National Journal vote ratings, and this is showing you the number of members between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat in the House and the Senate in different years. And so what you see here is that in the 80s, you had quite a lot of people who were sitting in between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat in both the House and the Senate. But as we get to the 90s, that number starts to decline, and really by 2002, it's even smaller, and in the current Congress, it's non-existent. So in 2012, there were no Republicans or Democrats sitting in between Olympia Snowe and Ben Nelson, it would have been at this time. And you would see the same thing now. No Republicans and Democrats in between Susan Collins, who would be the most liberal Republican, and Joe Manchin, who would be the most conservative Democrat from West Virginia. So how does this relate to what women do policy-wise? Well, as this polarization is occurring, there's a lot of it has to do with women, women's groups, the women's vote, women's policies. So here we're talking about the fact that my colleague was talking about civil rights. At the same time, women's groups, women's rights come about in this period too, and they align themselves with the Democratic Party. So women's groups become part of the base of the Democratic Party, making demands on the Democratic Party for diversity in who gets appointed as delegates to the convention, demanding more seats at the table. Geraldine Ferraro becomes vice presidential candidate, largely because of their pressure. The party adopts rules requiring women and minorities and youth to be represented at the presidential conventions, and we start to see a gender gap emerge in 1980, the Ronald Reagan election, that has continued fairly steadily with women tending to favor the Democratic Party. In truth, this gender gap appears more because men left the Republican Party than because women were flocking to the Democratic Party, but it is something that's been persistent where women tend to favor a little bit the Democratic Party. So that means as a voter base, the Democrats are going after women, and then within the base of the party, women's groups are central to the party base. So what this means is that Democratic women who get elected feel like that they are strongly supported by women and women's groups. We know Emily's List is a strong donor to women, particularly pro-choice Democratic women, but they feel that they tend to owe their election a little bit more to women and women's groups. Focusing on women's issues is only beneficial for Democratic women because it allows them to sort of feed the base of the party and pursue their own policy preferences at the same time. So what we see is as women's issues, particularly abortion, pay equity, family leave, tend to become issues that are seen as more partisan than bipartisan, so issues associated with the Democratic Party. When Democratic women are active on them, it's helping the party. So they go out there and do a lot of party messaging on these issues. So you can think of, in recent years, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act is the first bill that President Obama signed, and Democratic women were very pivotal to seeing that bill pass through Congress. Contraceptive coverage in the health plan as part of preventive services has been very controversial, a few Supreme Court decisions, that kind of stuff. Well, that's very much an effect of Democratic women pushing it on the administration and not allowing them to narrow who would be covered. So they wouldn't allow there to be an exemption for universities like mine that are nonprofit Catholic universities to, not have to cover contraception. They just tried to make other ways for them to be able to do it. So for Democratic women, it's win-win to focus on these policies, and they will attack Republicans and Republican women as Republican policies being policies against women. The war on women, a big theme for 2012, a theme for 2014 that didn't really work out for them this time, but it's definitely a theme of the party. For Republican women, it's a little more complicated. So as I said, women's issues have now become Democratic issues. So for Republican women, they don't get a lot of bang for the buck if they're focusing on these issues because these are Democratic issues. Republicans like to focus on lower taxes, less regulation, which I know is something that all of you are familiar with in your own work. So because of that, you're spending political capital on something that's not central to your own message, not necessarily central to the party. However, they are cross-pressured. If I am a moderate Republican woman, and here I show you Susan Collins at the top, someone like Susan Collins, she wins a lot of voters in Maine because she's moderate and she's pro-choice, and so that makes it easier for her to get election. So she will quietly vote that way, but she doesn't come out and speak against her party on it. For someone who's conservative, a little more conservative, like a Kelly Ayotte or Deb Fischer or perhaps now a Joni Ernst, she has to deliver a conservative message, and she's comfortable with, say, a pro-life message, but she doesn't necessarily want it to be her only issue. So she has to decide how much political capital am I going to allow to be spent on this, because since the Republican Party is looking for diverse faces, they would like to see her out there, more and more on these kinds of issues. So they have cross pressures. Now, it doesn't mean everything they do is partisan. So sometimes you can have issues that are not central to the parties, and the women will act in a bipartisan way. And the most obvious example of this is recent work on sexual harassment in the military. For the first time, you had 7 women serving on the Senate Armed Services Committee, and they cooperated with each other, and they didn't necessarily agree on the solutions, but they pushed for hearings, and they pushed for policies related to sexual harassment in the military. So looking to the future, what do we expect to see? Well, in general, we expect that women will continue to have more influence in the Democratic Party, which means not a lot of influence in the currently fully Republican-controlled Congress, but perhaps they might have more influence if a Hillary Clinton gets elected for president. Within the party, because there's more women there and they've been there longer, you see women gaining seniority and leadership positions in the Democratic Party. For the Republican Party, you have a couple of women in key positions like Kathy McMorris Rodgers on the House side for the chair of the Republican Conference, but they don't have enough seniority to get a lot of leadership positions. So Lisa Murkowski will control the Energy Committee, but there's not a lot beyond that. So I look forward to taking any of your questions about this or other issues related to polarization. Thank you very much.
Gabe Sanchez.
So good evening, everybody. I'm Gabe Sanchez, as you see, as was noted, local boy here from University of New Mexico. So thank you all for choosing Albuquerque. The local economy thanks you grandly. So as you kind of heard a little bit about it, and particularly as the first presentation noted from a historical perspective, my job today is to kind of close things out with kind of where we are right now with a little bit of projection into the future. I'll note my role with Latino Decisions. That's a survey firm that focuses primarily on the Latino electorate. So a lot of the data that I'll be bringing out is from Latino Decisions. I would check out our website. We have interactive maps, slide decks. All of our surveys will give you all the crosstabs too. It's great, particularly for those of you in the classroom that are looking for great visualization tools, particularly on a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about today. So I'm going to jump right into it. And this figure showcases really what the racial and ethnic composition of the American electorate looks like, from 1976 projected out in the future. A couple of things I want to note here is that you often see these kind of projections focused on overall aggregate population. This is exclusively electorate numbers, so these are voting eligible population projected out into 2024. So long story short is you see the non-Hispanic white population decreasing in overall size and influence as the non-white population increases over time. Depending on which demographer you ascribe to or trust, you see that things start to converge somewhere around 2050 is when you really start to see not just the overall aggregate population, but specifically the electorate start to kind of converge at that point. A number of states, New Mexico being out in front, are already essentially at that majority-minority electorate. So we're not talking about just overall population, but voting eligible in New Mexico. Just for some context, given that we're here, about 40% of our overall electorate is Hispanic alone in New Mexico. So you add the Native American numbers, small but vibrant Asian American community and African American communities, and we're essentially at about 50-51% of voting eligible minority population. So a number of states are already kind of advancing beyond what we see at the national level. A lot of folks ask what's driving these underlying demography trends. It's obviously age and differences of age based on race ethnicity. So if you think about median age by race ethnicity in the United States, whites, median age is about 42, 42.3. All racial and ethnic minority populations are under the age of 30. 27, for example, for Latinos. 26 for Native Americans. So you see that age difference is really what's driving the underlying demography projected out in the future that you see here. One statistic that I think is pretty eye-popping, we were asked to kind of be somewhat controversial and try to invoke some conversation after this. I'll try to do as much of that as I can. One, I think, eye-popping number is that there's 73,000 Latino citizens of the U.S. who turn 18 and enter the eligible electorate every single month. Right? Just wrap your head around that in terms of changing electorate in the U.S. This number of 73,000 has already increased from 50,000 in 2012. So in D.C. circles in 2012, we were all talking about 50,000. That's already increased to 73,000 just that quickly. Right? So just kind of give you some snapshot of really, in most demographers' opinion, Latino population really driving the underlying numbers that we're seeing. You've seen this data presented from the first talk. I'm going to kind of dive a little bit deeper in terms of what the rising American electorate looks like. This showcases just from 2008 to 2012 alone. So really taking a very recent snapshot of some of the changing dynamics of what we refer to as the rising American electorate. So if you take a look across both race, ethnicity, age, marital status, the intersection between that and gender, LGBT community, in every single instance, essentially, you're seeing an increase in their vote share of the overall electorate, right? And what that results to is if you think about the non-RAE community, that's essentially non-Hispanic whites, you see that they actually decreased in terms of the percent change from 2008 to 2012. What that resulted in is 2012 often being referred to as the most diverse electorate in American history. Another way of thinking about that was the very first time in U.S. history that non-Hispanic whites, in terms of their overall share of the electorate, actually decreased from 2008. So really historic in terms of what we're talking about, changing underlying demography numbers, particularly as it relates to the electorate. On your far right of the slide, I think what's even more powerful than that is if you think about, essentially racial composition of the electorate and how that leads to polarization. If you look at the vote gap in terms of all these populations' support for Obama, take a look at some of those numbers. Plus 87 for African American, plus 52 for Latinos, for Asian Americans just lagging Latinos at 0.50. You see across the board, you essentially have two separate electorates, right, that are really, in most folks' opinions that study political behavior, is part of the underlying backdrop for why we're seeing the polarization in Congress. It's really two different separate electorates at play. Many folks would ask, well, Professor Sanchez, isn't that just being driven by an Obama effect, a candidate effect, so to speak? Well, at least in the context of Latinos, many people forget 2008 primary, remember, Hillary Clinton killed Obama in terms of Latino support. So many people, we've played with this in terms of Latino decisions and survey data, these numbers might actually be the same or significantly higher if it were Hillary Clinton that we were talking about and not President Obama. So, sure, Obama effect is driving some of this, but at least in the context of Latinos, this was already underplay well before that election. Another way to think about racially polarized voting is if you look at the context of the candidates' vote margins, and you've heard a little bit about this in the context of both previous presentations, take a look at just the increase in a relatively short period of time from 2004 of where Republican presidential candidates get most of their votes from in terms of the electorate. In 2012, nearly 90%, right, specifically from the non-Hispanic white population. Again, thinking about this in terms of two separate, distinct electorates. What about off-year elections? Even greater. Right, in 2010, 90%. I was just starting to play with the numbers from now in 2014. It looks like it increased slightly even from 2010 to 2014 in terms of off-year election. So again, thinking about two separate electorates electing two different sets of people to make policy decisions. What about at the state level? Again, pretty eye-popping number, I believe. Less than 2% of all GOP state legislators are of one of these racial and ethnic background, Asian American, African American, Latino, or Native American. If you take New Mexico out of that equation, New Mexico has the most, I guess, diverse is one way to think about it, disparity in terms of Democrats and Republicans. In other words, you see more minority Republicans elected to office in New Mexico than anywhere else in the U.S. You take them out, that drops to about 1.5%. Right? Just to kind of give you an idea at the state level, for those of you studying state policy, part of the polarization is pretty obvious, less than 2% in terms of the racial and ethnic makeup of who the GOP is electing. You've seen a number of maps. I'll show you a few. This one should look familiar. This is isolating Latino influence. Part of the backdrop of the immigration polarization discussion is this Latino influence? Are they really influential? You're hearing a lot of that back and forth conversation. This shows you essentially what the electoral map looked like in 2012. This is with Latinos. Latino decisions had Latino support for Obama at 75%, record number for Latinos, and 10% of the overall electorate. Again, record for Latinos reaching double digits. That's essentially what the electoral map looks like. At Latino Decisions webpage, you can play with these maps, isolate specific variables, hold others constant to kind of play around with what scenarios might look like projected out into the future. Just one, which is in line with demographers' take for what about 2024 will look like, when the Latino share of the electorate looks at 16% of the overall national vote. So not a huge difference, 10 to 16. Take a look, I'll go back at what state flips, holding everything else constant, assuming everybody else's vote share and voting behavior stays the same. It's the state of Texas. Flips at that point. So obviously that's a big deal. It's no coincidence that things like photo ID law in Texas are being enacted because the underlying demography is there. In Q&A, I can talk a little bit about that. I co-wrote the expert witness report on the Texas photo ID law. Knock on wood, we were successful so far, and 2 of those court decisions in Texas. We'll see how it plays out down the line. But for Republicans in the room, what would happen if the GOP actually got closer to what they did under the Bush years with Latinos at 40% of the electorate? Again, looks much, much different. Many of you might say, well, 40%, that's unrealistic, given 75% for Obama. Remember, former President Bush got 40% in both of his election runs with Latinos. Susana Martinez, GOP candidate here for governor, got well over that number for Hispanics in the state of New Mexico. So that is within reach. Final things I'll wrap up with, just to kind of talk a little bit about 2014. What explains what happened this week? It's a question most political scientists that study behavior have been talking about at length over the course of the week, at least in the context of Latinos. Quick snapshot, immigration. This is from a large 5,000 sample of Latino voters and just this last week. Take a look at immigration policy, outpaced jobs and economy. That's a complete reverse of what we saw even in 2012. And obviously, immigration policy has been at a standstill or a gridlock because of the polarization issue. As a result of that, a lot of Latinos stayed home on voting day, so you saw a significant drop in turnout. And if you take a look at, again, 75% support for Obama in 2012, wasn't groundbreaking drop, right? If we take a look at the national support for House of Representative candidates among Latinos from 75 to 69, but in states like Colorado, that 6% drop, or at least in Colorado's case, it was more like 78 support for Obama. So that drop explains a lot of why you saw some of the elections, supposedly surprising election outcomes in the state of Colorado. Same dynamic in the U.S. Senate. Again, not groundbreaking shifts. It's not accurate to say that Latinos increased their support for Republicans. More accurate to say they decreased their support for Democrats in 2014 is what the data is suggesting. And finally, one of the big reasons for a drop in turnout, and this is again a survey of voters. So these are the folks that are voters in off-year elections. For those of you that study who's to be contacted, these are on like 10 out of 10 ratings of people you need to contact. Of that sample, only 39% of Latinos said they were contacted by anybody, party, candidate, interest groups. 40% of the most likely to be contacted segment of the electorate. I think that explains more than anything else why you saw a significant drop in Latino turnout. Thank you very much.
Anybody going to have a fit if we move this so we can see people over there and they can see us? Is that okay? I don't see anybody. All right, so I'm going to ask a couple questions and then it'll be your turn. Doug. So you laid out this amazing, I probably ought to put it over here. Okay. You laid out this amazing set of numbers about how, what's, okay. So you laid out this amazing set of numbers, and they show this turnaround in the South especially, that used to be the solid South for Democrats, now the solid South for Republicans. Tell us what you think Republicans can do to reduce the consequences of that change so that they can, and I'm going to ask Gabe the same question, so that they can get more votes from minorities, especially blacks in the case of your presentation.
Well, I think the Hispanic vote is the more important going forward, but it's a great question. Again, I think the Republicans are at something of a crossroads. The results yesterday were a little stronger than the polls suggested, but not very surprising, really, in terms of a midterm. So what happens as we go forward? Well, I think there's two scenarios. If the Republicans stay as deeply divided internally as they presently are, by default, they will continue to be extreme. Their policy positions in the House in particular will remain extreme. And given the demographic trends that Gabriel laid out so beautifully, over some 6 to 8 to 10 years, that demographic noose is going to tighten to the point where I think you would see Democrats move back into a position of policy dominance, at least at the federal level. That's one scenario. I think the other one that's at least plausible is that it involves the establishment Republicans moving aggressively to try to bring the Tea Party wing of the party to heel and to move the party in a more centrist direction. The party as a whole is conservative, so it wouldn't be a huge move back to the center, but move back to the center on certain crucial issues like immigration reform. And Gabriel's right. I mean, you don't have to go back very far to find a much more competitive Latino electorate. And if the establishment Republicans could do that, could move the party in a more centrist direction, they're in a position to at least forestall some of the losses of this demographic noose. I think there's two motivations. One is the demographics that Gabriel laid out so well. The other is that the Republicans now control Congress. It's one thing to be obstructionist in a divided Congress. It's another when you control Congress if they remain very extreme in their policy preferences and nothing essentially happens over the next 2 years. I think voters will remember that and will extract. Obama can't be blamed at that point. He won't be president anymore. So I think there are establishment Republicans who want desperately to move the party back in the direction of kind of a more centrist direction to try to take advantage of some of these demographic shifts.
Okay. In that regard, I can recall in 1994-95 when Republicans took over the House, they did the opposite of what you're suggesting.
That's right.
They went to the right. They thought they were binding the President of the United States, a guy named Bill Clinton. I was in many meetings with Republicans when they were, pounded their chest, masters of the universe, they're going to force the president and so forth. So he vetoed everything, which people didn't think he would do. And then there were several come-to-Jesus meetings among Republicans basically saying, we need to be more centrist, we got to pass legislation, we need Democratic votes to do it, and we've got to have the president sign them. if they do that again, it might be too late.
Yeah.
I mean, they better not go all the way. So it's going to be an interesting time. I would like you to give a 1-minute answer to this, okay? You got it quick so I can ask the other two questions. You suggested at the beginning that you could see a way that this election could actually begin to move the Congress back toward a less polarized position. What do you mean by that?
Well, essentially it's the second scenario I just laid out. That is, establishment Republicans move the Republicans slightly more in a centrist direction, but they're going to have to exert more party discipline than they've been able to show to this point. If they're able to do that, and there's at least the beginnings of some possibilities for bipartisanship again, they in fact could move forward, I think successfully, along the lines that Gabriel laid out.
Good. Michelle, in the last 2-3 years, I've had a lot of experience working with Republicans on birth control. There are several recent studies, 2 of them statewide, that show that effective use of birth control dramatically reduces the abortion rate, more than anything else known to man or God. You would think that that would cause Republicans, especially women, to be fanatics about use of birth control because it addresses one of the issues they're most concerned about, which is human life. And yet they're resistant to saying things, especially publicly. Sometimes behind the scenes they'll say, well, I won't oppose it. But they're very reluctant to say anything. Why? Can you explain that?
So I think that the reason Republicans don't want to go public with that sort of thing is because there's still a very strong social conservative portion of their base. And it's very tricky in terms of appeasing them because many of them see contraception as essentially an abortifacient, and that they would see movement in that direction, particularly if you got more widespread use of something like RU486 as condoning abortion. So as long as the pro-life community, particularly in some of the more social conservative groups, really make up a strong key part of their base, and what you were showing with 90% white voting in the 2012 election, that's still their stronghold, and those people are going to be opposed to that. In terms of some of the other things you guys were talking about, I don't see immigration reform happening in the next Congress. I just heard Reince Priebus talking about border security first yesterday, and that's because if you're looking demographically at the things that you were showing, in House districts, Republican House districts, the demographics are very, very white. They don't have a lot of minorities in their House districts. So this explains why immigration reform has only moved in the Senate, because the Republicans representing a statewide electorate have a more diverse population to represent, and so they do see a little bit of that. But the House still doesn't.
All right, Gabe, I want to begin by repeating a few of your numbers, which
Sure.
are just
I went through them fast, I know.
Are shocking. So if present tense trends continue, by 2024, 37% of the electorate will be non-white.
Correct.
37%, a huge increase. In the last election, 75%, not this 2014, but 2012, 75% of Latinos, 75% of Asians, and 93% of blacks voted for the Democratic ticket. So the math projecting into the future seems to be unavoidable. Republicans face a catastrophe. The question is, what can they do to avoid that, and are you available to help them?
Second question, I don't know. That's my mother and father might disown me if I did that. But I think on the first part of the question, a lot of it has been a little bit of covered ground. I think an incredibly uphill battle. I don't see a path for increasing, inroads with the African American community. That's more of a historic pattern. There's a lot of factors well beyond what we're seeing in the most recent elections that have driven that. For Latinos and Asian Americans, however, I do see a path to doing that. Unfortunately, it's extremely difficult because of what my colleague has already noted. And that's not even necessarily moving aggressively to pass comprehensive immigration reform, but backing off the rough rhetoric behind that. So if you take a look at Romney, for example, what really was pushed hard to the right on self-deportation. That was not in his policy agenda before the primary, but the primary really forced him in that direction. So I think the path, and I'm stealing a little bit of this from Frank Sherry from America's Voice. I was speaking on a panel with him earlier this week, and we both agreed that the most likely scenario for comprehensive immigration reform happening is not with a Democratic president in 2016, but actually a Republican president like Jeb Bush. So if he can emerge victorious through the Republican primary, he's already alluded he thinks that's in the best interest of the party. He wants to make that happen, and I think it's a greater scenario if he's in play than even a Hillary Clinton. So I think that is plausible. Our polling data indicates that about 40% of Latinos voters are indicating they would be much more optimistic about voting for the GOP if they, got out of the way and at least allowed CIR to pass, even a greater percentage if they actually took the lead. Other things to consider, many people question, well, wouldn't that just create a whole new slow of Latino Democrats? Keep in mind, most Americans, where do we get our party ID from? Our parents, right? Latino immigrants, they don't have that connection, that family socialization, that anchor, so to speak. So they are actually the most in play, right, or swing potential voting bloc that there could be in the United States. And that support for the Democratic Party you're seeing among Latinos and Asian Americans is very fragile. And in fact, the enthusiasm for the Democrats is almost reaching the same level of lack of enthusiasm for the GOP among Latinos. So I see that path is realistic. The dilemma is Congress, where, if you remember after 2012, all the talk was, we've got to fix our strategy with Latino voters. The party's in danger if we don't do that. Most Republican strategists, after getting over the election a week later, were calculating that, well, maybe not, because in most congressional districts, because of redistricting, that happened because most of the states shifted to the GOP right in the last redistricting round, really created districts where most folks are very comfortable screaming, hard right conservative attitudes on immigration because they don't have to worry about Latino voters.
Okay, so join me in thanking the panel because we started about 6 to 7 minutes late, and we still left 30 minutes for the audience, which was our goal from the very beginning, so thank you, panel. So ask good questions, and don't take up a lot of time when you ask a question. The worst thing in the world is when some of the audiences stand up and give a 5-minute talk. We don't want that. You make a brief point, but then ask a question as succinct as possible. Tell us your name and where you're from, and wait for the microphone to get there. Go ahead.
Hi. Hello, I'm Paul Peterson from Harvard University. And I'm picking up on the last point. It seems to me that the focus of the conversation has been a lot on Congress. And Congress is important, obviously, but the president is probably more important in driving dynamics politically. Johnson was extremely important in the transformations that were described just a few minutes ago. So I think a lot could happen. The economy is another big thing. So economic developments have profound effects for political parties, and demographics can take a second place to economics quickly, and presidents can change a party's definition. And certainly Jeb Bush is indicating that he's eager to do that. And so maybe the rest of you could comment on what you would think of whether or not it's possible for a presidential candidate like Bush, whether or not he could change the Republican Party's image in this regard.
Yeah, it's a great question, and Gabriel's already said a lot on that topic, and I think I wanted to echo a couple things he said. Yes, I think you're quite right. Jeb Bush would have to come through the primaries, and the primary dynamic plays very heavily to the kind of the base of the Republican Party, that is the Tea Party wing. We saw this in 2012, where Romney had to come through this kind of gauntlet. That's where the kind of that wing of the party, I think, has maximum voice. So the question is, could Bush survive that? If he did and continued to assert a kind of more centrist policies through the primaries, and actually, I think he'd be a very formidable candidate in the general election. And I agree with Gabriel. It's much more likely that we get comprehensive immigration reform with Bush as president than we likely will in the next 2 years for the reasons that both Michelle and Gabriel laid out. But again, as attractive as Jeb Bush may be as a kind of centrist candidate, he's got to come through primaries where the Tea Party wing of the movement has a lot of power. Romney, for instance, did not carry the majority of voters if you aggregated all the other primary candidates in 2012.
Go to the back on the left, will you please? The woman whose hand is up.
Picking up the Louise Comfort, University of Pittsburgh, to what extent do you think the anti-immigration movement is really fueled by a fear of the increase in the Hispanic electorate and the shift of the electorate towards the Democrats.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So one thing, and it's kind of a piggyback on the last question, I think economics has a lot to do with why immigration really emerged as this big wedge issue. Remember, it emerged and became so divisive right around the time the economy crashed, right? So that fueled everybody's fear about immigrants taking jobs and so forth, right? So I think a lot of it is that first graph that shows that the demography of the country is changing. That's the whole Browning of America theory, right? So I do think a lot of that is fueled by fear, but a lot of it, to me, hinges on the economy. And actually, within the Republican Party, I'm a little optimistic about Bush being able to emerge through the primary for two reasons. One is economy picks up a little bit. That really takes some of the sting off immigration being such a big, volatile issue that it is now. And second, a major segment of the establishment within the Republican Party needs immigrants for labor. And that's always been part of the backdrop of the economic side of the Republican Party, saying, what are we doing alienating that population? Look at states like Alabama that lost Latino immigrant population. The impact on the economy was huge. So I think a lot of it is being fueled by fear. Even keep in mind that if you look at 2000 data among Latinos, it was almost a 50-50 split in terms of their views on immigration policy. Because of these really a lot of Latinos view as anti-Latino policies across the states. States have passed a record number of immigration policies over the past 6-7 years. I think Latinos have become much more unified as a political bloc. Some of the numbers you're seeing are a result of immigration policy. So it somewhat cuts both ways, if that makes sense.
Another question? Right up here.
Hi, my name is Belinda. I'm a doctoral candidate at Columbia University. I had a question kind of directly relating to Doug's presentation. So you presented that whole timeline, and you talk about in the 60s with the civil rights movement, and you see that spike in the graph at that time. So I guess my question is also more of a general question in terms of what do you think the impact of international opinion and international politics are on these kind of domestic political movements? So for instance, in the 60s, I'm not a US historian, but we know what's going on with the Khrushchev, Kennedy back and forth, and how the civil rights abuses in the United States were kind of used as a point of, sticking it to the United States and saying, see, this is what you're doing, and you have no right to be the moral authority here when this is what's happening in your own state. So I don't know if that had any impact at all on impacting that spike you see in the 60s. And I guess this would also relate to currently the immigration policy currently, in that is there any role, or do you think that there's any kind of role for international opinion in pushing, if immigration becomes to be seen in the same way that the civil rights movement was seen? Is there any role for international politics and international opinion in pushing what's happening domestically?
Great question. Yeah, I've written a lot on this. I think that the reason the civil rights movement, the mass movement, emerged when it did is because of the Cold War. At least that was a very important part of it. Understand, America was very vulnerable on the issue in the context of the Cold War. American racism was a huge foreign policy liability, and international criticism is exactly what motivated the federal government, I think, to renationalize the issue of race after essentially neglecting it for 80 years. So Truman, almost as soon as he took office in 1945, began to speak out for the need to civil rights reform. And remember, the early 60s, the period where we really get the upsurge in civil rights activism, is also a period, one of the hottest periods of the Cold War. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is Berlin Wall, it's beginnings of Vietnam, it's Bay and Pigs. So yes, I think you're absolutely right. The international context was a huge factor in why the U.S. was vulnerable on the issue and began to actually move and change policies.
Yes, all the way up here in front.
Jane Waldfogel at Columbia University. So I was really, a fabulous panel, thank you all. I was really struck by the distinction between women's issues that are polarizing and women's issues that are not polarizing. So issues like abortion, polarizing. Issues like sexual assault, not polarizing. So I'm wondering if there are other women's issues that are not polarizing that could help move the electorate and politicians more towards the middle? We've been talking about issues that would, the influence of Latino voters in moving people towards the middle. Are there women's issues that could do that? I'm thinking about issues like gun control, health insurance maybe arguably was a women's issue, although maybe that ended up being polarizing. But are there other issues that you see on the horizon that could help bring women voters together, including women from the South?
Well, so women's issues is sort of a difficult term because it's like in the Supreme Court decision with pornography, and you know it when you see it. So everybody has a different definition as to what women's issues are. But if you sort of look at policy-wise where people do tend to come together in policy, Republicans and Democrats, Republicans are very strong on anything related to crime, right, and law and order. So Republicans have done a lot of work on, say, DNA testing with rape kits and things like that, even going back to the crime bill in the 90s. Anything related to sex trafficking, even the social conservatives are very concerned about sex trafficking. So those are areas where they can cooperate. And then also women's health issues not related to abortion. So research on osteoporosis, research on breast cancer particularly, there's been a lot of cross-partisan cooperation and emphasis, and even some Republican candidates will emphasize their support for things like breast cancer research to take some of the edge off of their abortion position. So there are certain issues like that that can be bipartisan. Gun control, I don't think, is one of them. Gun control, women voters care about it a lot and are much more likely to support gun control legislation, but really all of the movement in terms of where people prioritize gun control is on the pro-gun rights side. So that's why if you look at sort of the breakdown prior to Michael Bloomberg coming in and spending all the money being spent on lobbying, all the money being spent on advertising, the NRA and the pro-gun groups just dwarf any of the pro-gun control groups, even now with Michael Bloomberg and Gabrielle Giffords and those.
Next question up here in front.
Cliff Frazier, doctoral student at NYU. And yeah, picking up on the comment from Professor Sanchez about the economics of potentially immigration reform from a Republican point of view. In terms, I was struck by the argument in terms of in Alabama there may be a workforce argument in terms of immigration reform. I've heard a version of like the opposite argument. I'd be interested in your perspective, where by so much of the workforce which is working below minimum wages and which is essentially disenfranchised presently, which aligns with Latino immigration, once enfranchisement happens, then pressure for minimum wages goes up, et cetera, where workers are now part of the policy process, which could raise wages, et cetera. So would that put kind of a double bind on the parties thinking about this kind of thing, I guess? Thanks.
Yeah, that's interesting. In fact, that's actually an empirical question you can analyze off 2014 because you had many state ballots looking at rising minimum wage. And so I haven't crunched the data myself, but I got an RA starting to collect it. And so what my theory would be is, and this is how you would test that, you look at the percent increase in foreign-born or Latino population in those states, and your theory would, the hypothesis would be as that percentage increases. You don't want to use the raw number because a lot of it is how much it's increased over time in states like North Carolina, where you got a relatively small percentage of Latinos, but it's grown by over 1,000% in the last decade. And so your theory would suggest as that population is increased, support for those initiatives should have dropped, right, because of that cross-pressure economically. I think that might be part of the story, but that would be largely among elites, state legislators, members of Congress. I don't think the general population is making that calculus in that way. I think their views about immigration are fueled much more by an overlying fear around culture that was brought up in the back, not so much the economic threat at that level, if that makes sense.
We'll stay right up here in front. We'll come back in just a minute.
Thank you. This has been a fabulous panel. One of the things that none of you mentioned, which has been considered by many the defining issue of our time, is the issue of income inequality. How the parties deal with that, is it going to have any effect on what's going to happen in terms of polarization?
You've been great. Thanks a lot.
I'm Sonia Betez from New Mexico.
Okay.
I'll follow up.
So income inequality, yes, this is a huge question. So if you look at the demographics of districts, actually I saw something very interesting on this recently, and the districts that are represented by Democrats are actually, they have higher levels of income inequality than the districts that are represented by Republicans, because urban districts have more income inequality than rural districts do. So Democrats are going to kind of continue to hit that drum because their constituents are very much affected by it and do care a lot about it. And this fight over the minimum wage is part of it. On the Republican side, there are Republicans who want to say something about it. Paul Ryan comes to mind. Marco Rubio has a proposal related to the earned income tax credit expansion and doing that instead of raising the minimum wage because they feel it takes the onus off of business owners. So we might see more on it, and I think that it's going to continue to be an issue because income inequality has expanded so much in recent years.
Hi, I'm Andy Goth from Mathematica Policy Research. My impression is that 30 or 40 years ago, most people got their information from network news. And I was wondering if you think that some of the polarization we've seen recently can be explained by the rise of cable news. In other words, are people now feeling entitled to their own facts?
I think it's an issue. I certainly wouldn't say that's accounting for the polarization, but it is another influence. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, to the extent that someone was attuned to civics or politics, you tended to get your information from network news, and there was a kind of centrist discourse that was encouraged by sort of network news norms, if you will. At this point, the outlets are virtually unlimited, and if somebody is committed to the proposition that Obama is Muslim, oftentimes the first thing they'll do in the morning is log on to 2 websites that are committed to that proposition and find new evidence to support that truth. So there has been a real centrifugal force by the media in terms of kind of various different kinds of perspectives that are available out there. We don't have much of a centrist discourse, or certainly there's no monopoly on that centrist discourse the way there was 40, 50 years ago. I wouldn't overrate its significance. I think there's a lot of other more primary forces pushing the polarization, but it's not irrelevant.
I'll just add quickly, there's a debate in the poli-sci literature, at least on this, and it's a chicken or egg argument. It says, is the media following the public, right? So they're in the business of making money like everybody else, so as the populations become more polarized, they're giving the population what they want. Always. So there's an argument about whether the media is just following the population or if the population is following the media. So there's a lot of recent articles that kind of go back and forth. The data and the empirics are a little bit all over the place.
Where it probably has the most effect is elite polarization. So a lot of what happens is, voters look to elites for cues, and elites are certainly more polarized. Because if I looked at it just as, who has what viewership, well, MSNBC has maybe 9% viewership, and Fox is, up at 40, 50% viewership. So that's clearly not what's going on. But there is probably something to say regarding elites, because elites talk to each other on those medium and reinforce each other's viewpoints. And so if they're transferring messages to the general public, maybe that has some influence.
We have a question from the webcast. Zijan from New York University has a general question to all presenters. What do you think about the trend of education policy? Will Republicans make more education policy or less?
So education policy is so interesting right now, so thank you for that question. Basically, President Obama, and this goes to these questions of polarization in the legislature, Dr. Peterson was mentioning before, where the president is a little bit more important. Because Congress is polarized and they have not been able to reauthorize the No Child Left Behind Act, it's let President Obama do a lot on his own in terms of waivers. And so to get a waiver within the state, you need to accept his policies versus sort of race to the top grants and things like that. Now that the Senate is changing hands, Lamar Alexander is going to be the new chair of the Senate Help Committee. Lamar Alexander was a former Department of Education secretary. He cares a lot about education. He's not very happy with Obama administration policies. And so you might see more movement related to education policy because of that new dynamic.
But what would it be?
What would it be?
Yeah, what policies do Alexander Republicans favor?
So, of course, Republicans have long favored school choice. And so that's something that they want to see more school choice. They want to see more accountability and standards and things like this. So probably more on that question. They also are concerned about student loans. And student loans is something where you might see some sort of bipartisan effort. And then this question of for-profit schools. I see Dr. Peterson might want to add too, since this is his real area of expertise.
I'll just add quickly that Latinos, in terms of all issues that Republicans have the best shot at right now, gravitating Latino voters, school vouchers and school choice is one where Latinos really line up more so with the Republican stance on that than Democrats. African Americans as well, Asian Americans to a slighter extent than that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It turns out that somebody I worked with very closely was the person who worked very closely with Lamar Alexander to prepare a bill which is already sitting in the Senate committee, which reflects the Republicans' position. And it's saying basically we got to have accountability and we got to encourage states to create more choice, just as you were saying, but otherwise we should leave this to be a state and local issue. So I think that's going to be the moderate position. The Tea Party position is we don't want any federal involvement, going back to the days of Ronald Reagan. So there's going to be a struggle within the Republican Party over this issue. I think the moderates are working very hard to try to keep the federal role as an accountability. We want to know how well these schools are doing, but we're not going to tell you what to do about it.
And Paul, say one before you give up the mic. Give him back the mic. Say something about Common Core.
Oh, Common Core. Well, I think, basically, they're quite divided in the same lines. I mean, you got Jeb Bush out there pushing the Common Core, and that's going to have an effect on all these centrists in the party. And he sees that as an important part of the strategy for moving to the middle. But you've got the Tea Party, which has made this into a very high-profile issue. So I think that's a good example of what Doug was talking about there, that the Tea Party is going to put pressure on the middle. I think they're going to try to duck that altogether.
More questions?
Elizabeth Crow from the Congressional Research Service. The baby boomers started to retire in 2011 and will continue to retire aggressively moving forward for about the next 20 years. Do you think that will have an effect on the electorate, especially because you have a young Latino and or minority population emerging?
I don't see the effects as particularly strong. I mean, baby boomers, they're slightly more liberal in their politics, but only slightly. By virtue of their age, they are disproportionately white in terms of current demographic trends. So even if there's a slight exiting of slightly more liberal white voters, that's not going to have a big impact relative to these extraordinary demographic shifts that Gabriel was talking about earlier.
I'll just say one caveat to, the age is a double-edged sword. So on one hand, it's fueling the minority electorate growth, but on the other hand, right, who's the population least likely to vote? 18 to 24-year-olds. So that's why you're going to see a continuous lag, the sleeping giant effect, so to speak, for all of those populations, because it's going to take a while for that population to become of age politically, really in terms of political socialization.
One last thing, it doesn't relate to your question per se, but no one said this explicitly, although Gabriel certainly sort of implied or maybe gestured to this. The epidemic of restrictive voting laws, new restrictive voting laws, the claim again is this is to address the looming issue of voter fraud, but there's something fraudulent in that claim, and that voter fraud has not been a significant problem in this country. You have to go back to the era of machine politics for that to be the case. These restrictive voting laws would have the effect of restricting the franchise to traditional Democratic constituencies. And I think that's, again, by design. There's an awareness of this kind of demographic noose, And this is a rational strategic response to try to maximize the value of every white vote.
Real quick stat to scare you with, in Texas alone, if that ID law was passed, our report showed there'd be 1.2 million Latino and African American eligible voters disenfranchised, just like that. So you think about the partisan differences and what that means in terms of outcomes. I mean, I think it somewhat speaks for itself.
Was there one more question back there? Oh, right here. You still have a question? No, he doesn't. Okay, well, if you get to the end, stop. Thank you, everybody, and join me in thanking the panel.